Times front page for Tuesday, March 28, 2023. I'm George Gerbo. The latest mass shooting in an American school happened in Nashville, where 3 children and 3 staff members were killed by a former student armed with multiple assault-style rifles. Matt Delaney and Jeff Murdoch report the violence at the Covenant School took place when the shooter, a 28-year-old biological woman who identified as a man, shot through a locked side door of the building. Metropolitan Nashville Police said responding officers entered the private Christian school and moved toward the sound of gunshots before encountering the shooter on the school's second floor. 2 officers opened fire, killing the shooter. The shooter was carrying 2 assault-style rifles and a pistol, and police found a drawn map planning the attack, as well as a manifesto. Police said 2 of the firearms were obtained legally in the Nashville area. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu will delay his judicial overhaul plan to avoid civil war amid demonstrations, worker strikes, and a rebellion in his own cabinet. In a nationally televised address, Ben Wolfgang reports Netanyahu said he had a duty to tamp down the growing unrest across Israel and pledged to work with political opponents to find a compromise. He delivered the address after 2 days of widespread protests and near paralysis of the Israeli economy, with many flights grounded, shopping centers shuttered, and looming strikes in key sectors. Netanyahu's political opponents welcomed the announcement, but expressed reservations about the Prime Minister's long-term intentions. North Carolina has ended years of opposition and opted to expand its Medicaid program next year. Tom Howe reports that means 4/5 of the states have embraced a key plank of the Affordable Care Act. Previous opponents of the program have found it harder to resist federal funding, and voters have forced a series of Republican-led states to extend coverage. For a decade, many Republican leaders were against Obamacare's expansion of Medicaid, the federal state insurance program for the poor. But states are finding it harder to resist the federal dollars that underpin Medicaid expansion, which the Supreme Court made optional for states in 2012 before it was implemented the following year. Only 10 states haven't yet opted in, compared with 19 that refused expansion at the end of the Obama administration. You can read all these stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page. You can also find the entire lineup of Washington Times podcasts at WashingtonTimes.com/podcasts. The inflation rate has soared in the past 2 years to a peak of 9.1%, sapping the purchasing power of Americans and spurring higher interest rates. Dave Boyer reports Washington has thrown several $1 trillion into the economy to help Americans and businesses recover from the pandemic. The first aid package, the $2 trillion CARES Act, was signed by then-President Trump in March 2020. Despite the economic turmoil and job losses during the pandemic, the annual inflation rate stood at only 1.4% when President Biden came into office. It's averaged 6.2% over the 2 years of his presidency, as the effects of all of that funding have made their way into the economy. They may win the most headlines, but Congress's ideological warriors fared badly in a study of their effectiveness as lawmakers. Stephen Dinan reports Vermont Democratic Senator Bernie Sanders and Massachusetts Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren were near the bottom of the rankings in a study by the Center for Effective Lawmaking. At the top of the list, meanwhile, was Michigan Democratic Senator Gary Peters and Texas Republican Senator John Cornyn and Florida Republican Senator Marco Rubio. The study looked at bills as they advanced through the legislative process over the past 2 years and looked at who was responsible for writing them. Democrats topped the list, to be expected given their control of both chambers at the time, but researchers said there was a striking amount of working across the aisle. And finally, Wyoming Governor Mark Gordon has allowed a bill barring biological males from female scholastic sports to become law without his signature. Valerie Richardson reports the Republican governor said he worries the law is overly draconian. He described the measure as a solution in search of a problem in a state with about 91,000 students and just 4 known transgender athletes. 18 other states have approved legislation preventing biological males from playing female sports based on gender identity. Find all today's front page stories at WashingtonTimes.com/front page or on the Washington Times app, and find us wherever you get your podcasts. Just search Washington Times in any major podcast app. You can also find us on Twitter and Instagram at Wash Times for breaking news, sports, commentary, and more. For the Washington Times, I'm George Gerbo.